A History of Southern Missouri and Northern Arkansas by William Monks, published in 1907. Union supplies captured by rebels. Number 42. In the spring of 1862, the department commander re-established the military post at Springfield. All of the commissaries and forage had to be conveyed from Rolla to Springfield, as the terminus of the railroad was at Rolla, by wagon trains a distance of 120 miles. It required a large escort of soldiers to guard the trains to prevent the rebels from capturing them. All of the country south of the Wire Road was in possession of the rebels. There was scarcely a wagon train that passed on the road without being attacked by the rebels. They made their attacks generally on the front and rear of the trains, and before the wagon masters could corral the trains, they would capture some of the wagons, make the teamsters drive into the woods, cut the mules loose from the wagons, take sacks of coffee, salt, sugar, and other commissaries, tie them on the backs of the mules, divide into small bunches, and retreat into the hills. Very often, the escort would have to send back to Rolla for reinforcements. The train would be tied up from 12 to 15 hours before it could move on. It became a mystery to the Federal commanders how the Confederates could concentrate a force of men numbering from 50 to 300, and the first intimation the escort would have, the rebels, would come out of the brush at some secluded spot, yelling, whooping, and shooting, and charge upon the wagon train. They would generally capture more or less of the loaded wagons with the above results, and it became a question with the military authorities at Rolla and Springfield how to capture or rout these bands, and as to how they managed to keep that number of men near to the Wire Road, and yet the Federals were unable to discover their hiding places. About the 15th day of August, the department commander ordered Captain Murphy to take 500 men and 2 pieces of artillery and move south from Rolla, to go as far south as he thought it would be safe, without placing his men so far inside of the Confederate lines that they might be captured, and if possible to learn the rebel movements and location of their troops. Captain Murphy broke camp at Rolla and moved south about 15 miles, was fired on by the rebels from the brush, marched about 25 miles, went into camp. On the next morning resumed the march, hadn't marched more than 5 miles until they were fired on from the brush. They were fired on 4 or 5 times that day and went into camp near Thomasville. The next day he threw out skirmish lines on each side of the command and resumed the march down the Warm Fork of Spring River. There was more or less skirmishing all day. He camped on the Warm Fork and the next morning marched over to the Mite, where he had quite a skirmish. The rebels again retreated in the direction of the Spring River Mill, where they were said to have 1,000 men. Here the command counter-marched back to Rolla, having captured 50 or 60 prisoners. Federals had a few men wounded. In the spring of 1862, the Federal troops advanced on Springfield from Rolla. The rebels retreated west, and the Federals again established a military post at Springfield. The rebels continued to retreat west until they reached Prairie Grove, where they concentrated their forces and the memorable battle of that name was fought, the Federal troops being victorious. The Confederates retreated from the state. The military post at Springfield, being over 100 miles west of Rolla, the terminus of the South Pacific Railroad, 3/4 of the distance being in possession of the rebels, all the forage and commissaries had to be conveyed by wagon train. The main rebel forces having been driven from the state, and all of the country south of the Wire Road, with few exceptions, being in possession of the rebels, the Union men with their families having been driven from their homes. The leading Confederate officers met and held a council of war and decided to change their tactics. First thing was to place 200 or 300 well-armed Confederate soldiers south of and near the wire road leading from Raleigh to Springfield, and so harass the wagon trains that the government wouldn't be able to get forage and commissaries through to Springfield, and thus force the Federals to abandon the post. In furtherance of this move, they ordered their soldiers to be taken near to the line of the road and divided into squads of from 5 to 25 men, conceal their arms and claim to be private citizens, live off the country, and be so arranged that when a wagon train was about to leave Raleigh, they could be called together on short notice, and when they wanted to make a more extensive raid, Confederate soldiers from as far south as the head of Spring River would march up and meet them and make a general raid. The government had considerable trouble to learn the hiding places of these men, but they finally got officers who were acquainted with the country and men who were bona fide citizens and knew who were citizens and who were not, and broke up their hiding places and drove them further south. It was learned that a part of this Confederate force was composed of men who claimed to be citizens when they were not making their raids.